Last week I just really tried to throw different issues in the subject matter or whatever, and today I'm really going to try and develop in a sort of orderly fashion what the issue is about. Really what it comes down to is to understand what the mechanics of morality is within Torah, as distinct from, let's say, halacha, but the perceptions of how to look at the ethical individual, or the perception of morality. So we'll start at perhaps the most simplistic definition of Judaism. And perception is that the challenge of Torah is to listen to God. So therefore, the perception begins at the idea that there is an outside source of ethical direction, i.e. Kadosh Baruch Hu, that tells you what to do. And the challenge is, do you listen to him or do you not listen to him? Okay, that's the most simplistic way of understanding it. And in that perspective, you would say that the Yetzer Tov is the drive to listen to him, and the Yetzer Hara is that which makes you not listen to him. And in that regard, there are two basic understandings of why you would not listen to Kadosh Baruch Hu. One is because of Taiva, right? And Aver L'Teivon, which basically means that you have drives, that the individual has drives that leads you away from listening to the outside authority. That was one perspective. Or Lahachas, which means you want to challenge the outside authority for the purpose of challenging the outside authority. But the perception is there's an outside authority, and the challenge that we have is to either abide by the outside authority or not abide by the outside authority. And the individual who abides by the outside authority, we call him Eved Hashem, which uses the word Eved. It can be translated as servant, but it can be translated as slave, in the sense that the very essence of the idea of a slave is that someone else is making the decision for this individual. Like the idea of a slave is that the master makes the decision of what the slave will do. Now, if you think about this in a certain way, Eved Hashem implies that we don't make the decision, we follow the decision of a Kadosh Baruch Hu as expressed through the halacha. Okay, and therefore our challenge is to abide by the authority of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, that's the most simplistic way of understanding the system. That system has already, right from the beginning, has certain problems with it. Okay, so if you think in terms of a slave, what does a master attempt to do in order to get the slave to abide by his authority? What you want to do is lessen the will of the slave. So, in that regard, there's certain things you do with the slave if you're a master. You know, down in the South, one of the grave things a slave could do, that can get a slave into really a lot of trouble with his master, or in a certain way, if you did this with a slave, you can get in a lot of trouble with the slave's master, is to educate them. There's an intent, if you want to have the will over someone else, you do not want to educate that person. Okay, so you take in terms of the Catholic Church. In a certain way, the Catholic Church had a very strong intention of maintaining a certain amount of ignorance among the masses in the Dark Ages. It was important that you don't want to bring forth the intellectual ability of the individual. Because once you start thinking, right, you start thinking for yourself. So that you take in terms of fundamentalists, right? The great evil, the great Satan to the fundamentalists in the South is the Ivy League universities, because you start to think. It's very interesting because if you ever speak to Rabbi Skobek, he'll tell you, okay, Rabbi Skobek is from Jews for Judaism, he'll tell you that whenever he starts talking to, let's say, Jews for Jesus, a fundamentalist, and he gives them a challenge, he'll say, I'll go home and pray about it. I don't go home and think about it, I'll go home and pray about it. Because you don't want to be involved because the perception is you want the authority, you want to totally bend yourself to the authority, and therefore you don't want to think. The fact is if a master does this, that's what a master attempts to do, is try and get you to stop thinking. That's one thing a master does. The master's attempt is to try and break the will of the slave so that the slave will abide by the outside authority. The other way the master does that is through fear. And it can be, and you can say that, we have that aspect also in terms of Yiras HaOnish, that isn't that the way you've had this perception of abiding by an outside authority. But the fact is, you're going to see that there's already some movements. I mean, the fact is some people have this perception that revelation, I gave the example from fundamentals, is that the revelation is to try and lessen any aspect of the will of the individual who is the recipient of the revelation. But already off the bat, you already see that this description is very problematic in terms of Torah. Because in Torah, right off the bat, the intellect in education is primary. Okay, the fact is that in terms of Torah, you have a mitzvah of limud Torah. There's an actual attempt to try and demand of individuals to be educated. Now, the fact is, if you look at the introduction of Moshe to Zigrat's Moshe, he asks a very significant question. He basically says, if a Kodesh Baruch Hu wanted to tell you what to do, couldn't he have just done it in a nice, simple way, without all these machlokas, with all these hakiras, with all these drashas, all these analysis? Why don't you just tell me point blank what this means? Okay, don't do this, so forth. So Moshe basically says it must be that Kodesh Baruch Hu wanted people thinking and analyzing the Torah more than even knowing the final conclusion. Okay? Moshe actually develops it from a famous medrash. There's a medrash that says that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Shemayim, he saw a Kodesh Baruch Hu writing the tagin on the letters, the little crowns on the letters. And he says, what are you writing all these crowns for? And he says, because in the future there'll be a Rabbi Akiva who will darshan thousands halachos from the tagin. Okay, we don't have one case of Rabbi Akiva ever doing a drasha based on the crowns. Okay, so what does that mean? So the fact is what Moshe really means is that it's not that he was asking about why you have to have crowns. He was asking, why did you make the language of the Torah, the analysis, the crowns, have so much importance? Why did you make them the royalty? Why did you make the language the royalty? So we have to look into it, make drashas, make analysis, come up with ideas. Why don't you just tell us point blank what you want us to do? And the answer is because in the future Rabbi Akiva will do drashas because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants a lot of learning coming out of the limud Torah. And he wants a lot of drashas. Lahagdil Torah, lahadira, to bring up more Torah, to expand Torah. So he says, so Moshe says that was even more significant than doing exactly what the right thing is.
Is it Ramosha's view of that medrash?
That's Ramosha's view of that medrash. So Ramosha basically says that that Torah's objective in many ways is to come up with new ideas. So therefore, what you have here is the outside authority, i.e. a Kadosh Baruch Hu, actually is doing something that's absolutely different than almost any other system that has authority figures. In any other system that has an authority figure, you specifically try to lessen their intellect. You want them not to think. You want to break their wills. All of a sudden, you have this system, and Kodesh Baruch Hu says, and here's the prime mitzvah, go learn Torah. Use your minds. Yeah.
Torah, but Yiddishkeit maybe is learning as well, but it also is faith. This is what I told you, this is what you have to do. You have to have faith. It's more like an evidence. You have to have faith and not to think for yourself in that respect.
It's an interesting question. What you're saying is faith not to think of yourself?
Right, you have to have a munah, regardless of what you believe or what you don't believe. This is whatever you think, what you don't think. You have to have a munah, and that's that.
Okay, so the question is that, what about the questioning of your faith?
Exactly.
Okay, is the question?
You can't question.
Is that really true? Okay, you see, it's an interesting issue in terms of, we always talk about the Akedah in this issue. Okay, in the Akedah, okay, you have this issue of Avraham listening to God. Okay, and it seems to be faith overriding reason, right? Faith, Avraham basically having this idea, this isn't right, that's irrelevant. Faith, God tells me to do it, I have to abide by faith. So the truth is, you actually have a disagreement in the philosophical analysis of this. Kierkegaard talks about the leap of faith, which seems to be faith has to override reason. The fact is that if you look at Kant said that was totally wrong. He felt Avraham was totally wrong, right? You had to abide by moral perspective. Okay. The fact is that Machokas was actually a Machokas between Avraham and Sarah, according to certain midrashim. Certain midrashim basically, Avraham did this, and Sarah was furious. But basically, as midrashim would say, that Sarah basically she this actually led to her death in the sense that she was totally upset by this, that Avram would go and do this. And there was something said this was going to happen. And Sarah was upset that I said for those blankety blanks in stone, Mishpat, this and that, it's not right, this is right. You're Yitzchak, the tzaddik Yitzchak, right? Your own son, the tzaddik, you don't open your mouth. So Sarah was furious with Avram. Fact is that it's a little bit of a question. The only thing is that it's interesting, because what I always felt with Kierkegaard's perception of the leap of faith is it's really a problem. If it was simply just a faith, that you just felt it, would Avram really have been right in doing it? The fact is, I don't think Avram was an issue of what you call faith. Avram had knowledge. He had a certain idea of what it meant to have God speak to you. It was not an aspect of faith, it was an aspect of Yediyah. He had the knowledge that God was telling him to do this. So that's why I think Kierkegaard's idea of it being a leap of faith would be problematic. Avram had to work with knowledge. And then he had to deal with the issue of, and eventually he asked this question, according to the Midrash, he says, I don't get it. On one hand, you tell me go kill Yitzchak. On the other hand, you tell me that through Yitzchak will be my Zerah. How does this work out? He had a question of reason. So the thing is, but it all starts with him having knowledge. So the question really exists. I think what I'm saying is that when you have faith, the question arises is what happens if there's certain challenges to your faith, and there's certain ideas. Is faith really supposed to ride any type of analysis, or is analysis supposed to come up with some reason also? In other words, this idea that faith always overrides reason, isn't reason necessary for you to look to make sure that your faith is not just some kind of crazy belief. And faith can, pardon?
It's all relative.
Well, it's tough. I mean, if you think about this in terms of faith, okay, if you want to talk in terms of faith, right, you can look at the Adas Korach as being remarkable people of faith, right? Moshe Rabbeinu comes up to them and says, "You do this, you're going to be in big trouble." And they take the Keturah, and they're going out into the Keturah against Moshe because they have such faith in Korach, and such faith that this is the right thing to do, right? And I mean, from reason, come on, Moshe Rabbeinu tells you not to do this. This is the man who's been talking to God. This is the man who's been every reason in the world should tell you, hey, maybe I shouldn't do this. At least be a little bit hesitant. They had to have remarkable faith in their perspective. The point is that there's always a tension between faith and reason, but we have this perception that faith overrides reason, but the truth is you need reason to investigate whether your faith is correct. And then even there's a certain limitation of how much reason can really understand faith. But there is that tension. So the point is that it is in a certain way, people who try to really push authority try to limit any use of reason, and a lot of times they'll bring out faith. That's why the Jews for Jesus will say, "Go home and pray about it," because they're really relying upon this faith idea. The point is that in a certain level, there is a certain perspective of Emunah. I'm not trying to denote that there is a concept of Emunah, but the fact is Emunah has to have some connection to reason. Okay, there has to be some connection. So the point is that in a certain way, if you have a question on your Emunah, that doesn't mean you just drop your Emunah, but it doesn't mean you just ignore the question either. You know, there's a statement I heard that I think it was Rabbi who says that your actions have to be totally, definite, halachically definite in your mind. You could be totally, like questioning in a lot of things. But the fact is that there's an interesting question about where does reason allow you to analyze faith, and we've always looked at that. I mean, the fact is that even the Kuzari, if you look in terms of the Rishonim, the Kuzari is one who seems to be really known for this idea of Emunah, right? As he understands it to be some aspect of a knowledge, rather than using just the word faith, a knowledge that's intuitive, right? To the Kuzari, like for example, you go back to how did Avraham know about Kodesh Baruch Hu? So the Rambam says, based upon the measures that Avraham was 40 years old, it's all through reason. Kuzari looks at the measures that Avraham was 3 years old, and he develops this whole idea. It's based upon the Nishma, that he had the unique Nishma. And the Nishma, because he had the unique Nishma, he had this intuitive knowledge of God, right? So the Nishma knows God. Now, I'm not going to challenge that. There is a possibility that our Nishma is going to know God. I mean, the fact is that this is a constant concept within ourselves, that there's a drive for us to go back to Kodesh Baruch Hu from our Neshamas. Okay, so there may be an intuitive aspect to a person from their Neshama. But even the Kuzari, in arguing that, which is, I think, an aspect of what I would define as a definition of faith from a Torah perspective, that it's the Neshama intuition that we have. But he himself says that nothing he says is going to be a kinetic reason. Because the fact is, how do you know it's in your Neshama? How do you know it's really from your Neshama? How do you know it's just some, mishigas in your mind, right? As evidenced by all the people who have faith, right? Such as suicide bombers, So that's the challenge that really is extremely significant from a Jewish perspective, from a Torah perspective. While we do abide by Emunah and consider the fact that we have to have Emunah b'Hashem and we have to accept the authority of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is this issue of reason as well, which leads us to sort of balance out. Just because something's not, there's certain questions we have, we don't have to walk away and say, well, I'm going to lose my faith because I have a question, right? I mean, some people did, let's say, after the Holocaust. I mean, the fact is that it's a question. Tzaddik v'Ralo, is that going to lead you to lose your faith? Well, there were many people who stopped believing after the Holocaust, and I'm not going to be the first. I'm not going to. That's up to Kodesh Baruch Hu. I'm not going to in any way judge such individuals. But on the other hand, there is a point in time where Emunah may say, listen, there's an answer. I just don't have the answer because I'm not God and I don't have all the wisdom. But to understand the mechanisms and the balances, that's a significant thing. But the fact is in a lot of systems that basically try to push that authority, they basically say that reason is the challenge, because you have to just believe. Like fundamentalist Christians just really push belief, and then they'll sit there and say, and God challenges you with all these issues of reason and so forth.
But isn't there a kind of much simpler understanding of some of these issues? Because even if our goal is to unquestionably obey the will of God, in order for us to determine the will of God, there is a tremendous reasoning process that goes on. For exactly the reason you just gave earlier, is that God wrote obliquely.
Right, so that exactly is the starting point of this issue, in the sense that Moshe is basically pointing out that if God wanted to give over a very straightforward idea of authority, which is like, you look at at fundamentalist Christians, it's got to be taken literally. And really, in terms of a lot of Torah perspective, we never got caught up in this whole thing with the Darwin and stuff like that, because we had shalas already on what Bereshis meant. But the fact is that it never really bothered us, because we weren't so, it wasn't so necessary that it had to be literal. But the Christians had to be literal, because they really challenged the aspect of fundamentalist Christians, the idea of thinking at all. But our whole system starts with a challenge to the authority. That's what I'm trying to say. That the fact is right off the bat, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, abide by my authority. What I basically presented is that authority, any authority figure like that tries to get you not to think, right? If you really want to exercise really strong authority, best thing is to try and get you to be a robot and not think. Kodesh Baruch Hu now says, okay, and here's the first challenge: you've got to think to figure out what I mean. Right? Well, how do you know? Maybe your taivas are getting involved in that level. Maybe this is getting involved. No, but whatever it is, you have to think to figure out what God is telling you to do. Which means, already off the bat, I'm entrusting you, Kodesh Baruch Hu is entrusting you to exercise some will. Right? Imagine a master saying, okay, you gotta try and figure out the slave. Okay, slave, try and figure out what I mean, and then make that decision. Okay? Now, it's going to get a little further than that,
It puts tremendous pressure on the slave.
Yeah.
By the way.
Right. But remember, you also understand the Tanur Shalchnai story a little bit more. We'll get to it in a second, because Tanur Shalchnai story says, and in the end, what you decided that I meant for you is right. Right? In other words, I'm the master. I'm going to tell you to decide what to do. You come up with a whole cheshbon to say you're supposed to do this. Really, that's not what I wanted, but that's what you decided. That's what we're going to go with it. Already, there's a shift happening here in terms of the simplistic understanding of the starting point of Torah.
Why define slavery?
In the beginning point over here of slavery, what we're talking about is the fact that the slave has an outside authority telling him or her what to do. There's her individual will, or his individual, is absolutely irrelevant. The will that decides what this person will do is an external authority, i.e. a master outside of that individual. So that's the extreme of slavery, and that seems to be the starting point of our understanding of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But already off the bat, God does things that challenge the simplistic understanding of slavery. Okay, so now, this is what I'm saying. So the fact is that in that regard, already off the bat, a master will try and, a lot of times, again, you see from the slaves in the South, try to limit education. HaKadosh Baruch Hu absolutely didn't want to limit education. Mitzvah of Talmud Torah, right? You also try and use fear, right? Break the will. We have a concept of Yiras HaOnish, but it's the lowest level of relating to Kodesh Baruch Hu. It's not a level that's supposed to be objective. So already we're moving on to a further idea. So what you have here is this perspective of moving to a new standard. Which what I'm getting at is that, again, the title in terms of revelational ethics versus personal ethics. The point is, in revelational ethics, it's the idea that ethics come from outside of yourself. And already the question of personal ethics is the fact that you develop your own ethical system internally. And the point is that's a movement that in a certain way moves away. Because in the starting point of revelational ethics, and if you really look at it in terms of, let's say, the way a lot of non-Jewish philosophers looked at Judaism, and it gives you, and I'm using that as an example to see what others see, to see a perspective from a narrow perception, is that they one of the great issues with Judaism was always the law. Okay, the fact that Judaism was considered to be the issue of Torah was law, and Christianity always attacked Judaism for focusing on the law and the limits of the law. And the way that was understood is a term, let's say, that Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburger uses, a term called act morality, where all Judaism is interested in is the action. It doesn't care what you feel one iota. It just talks about what you should do. Okay, now, that is almost in the extreme of trying to develop a robot. Okay? The robot just does an action, and the idea is that the one who's telling the robot what to do is the outside authority, i.e. Kodesh Baruch Hu. So this perception is there's so many laws in this system that it's just trying to tell you what to do. Okay? But who you are, what kind of person you are internally, your emotions, your being is irrelevant to that system. In fact, the argument being that that kind of system doesn't want it to be relevant, because the more you develop the will in terms of yourself, the more problematic it is in terms of the authority figure basically, having that authority. So the point is, what I've done over here is that right off the bat, you have this idea of authority versus doer. Okay, in other words, there's the doer, and who makes the decisions of what the doer should do. So in a fundamentalist system, it's the outside authority, i.e. God or whatever. And all of a sudden, within Torah, it's, we believe it's the Ratzon Hashem, but to determine the Ratzon Hashem, already off the bat, the Ratzon of the individual is somehow involved. And that first step of the Ratzon of the individual being involved is a step that the Ratzon Hashem has to in turn be defined by the Ratzon of the individual.
It's not actually the individual, it's the learned Rav. It's not really I can't decide that I'm hungry for pork and I want to go out and eat pork.
Right.
So I can't just go make that decision.
Right. But you're right. It's making a decision given certain rules. You can't make any decision you want. Even a learned individual cannot say you can eat pork. But the fact is, there are certain rules that this individual has to use. Okay, so it seems to me that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done is sort of said that I want you to make decisions based upon these rules. Okay, but that does give you some aspect of your own ratzon. Okay, on a certain level.
On a certain level, but
yes.
It's really not you. It's not me or somebody else who's not at that level making any of these.
But you're right. You're right on the certain level. The fact is that when you actually look at it, it becomes a little bit more of an issue because when there was a Sanhedrin, then there was an ultimate authority in the Sanhedrin. So even if you were a very learned person, even if you were the Gadol Hador, but everyone else in the Sanhedrin disagreed with you, if you disagreed, you'd be a Zaken Mamre. So there is a certain ultimate level of authority after Rabbi and so forth. But the question is majority. But the interesting thing is on the other hand, there is a certain amount of autonomy. What I point out to people today is that it's true that individuals, not any individual can make a decision, right? And
I think that's a problem with conservatives or whatever.
Absolutely.
I think
right. But there is a decision that every frum person does make. Okay, that does impact on their halachic process, and that decision is.
Free will.
No, I understand, but what do frum people do that basically impacts on their decisions that every individual has to make that decision?
We finished now.
I'm sorry?
But we finished now.
No, what I'm getting down is actually a decision. The individual will make decisions that will impact on his behavior.
Ask a Shiloh.
Okay, that's true. Now, what decisions does a person make in asking a Shiloh?
I'm not sure if this is right, so I'm going to go ask.
Yeah, that's true, but
Not to exercise free will.
no. But in asking the Shiloh, that individual will be making a decision. Okay, in the process of asking a Shiloh. that will impact on the halachic decision making.
Would they may accept the answer?
No. For sure they're going to accept the answer of okay, who they ask. Right? Who is your Rav? Who do you ask? You want a shaila? Okay, very, very good. You want to not cover your hair? I can give you a rabbi right now. You'll get a shaila with many sources that will say, don't cover your hair. You want to wear pants? You want a woman to wear pants? I'll give you something to go ask right now, and I know exactly what the answer is. You want an answer that says you can't even wear a sheitel? I'll tell you who to ask. Now, do people do this? Yeah, a little bit. In the secular world, that's called forum shopping. But in the broader perspective, it's an aspect of what type of Judaism do you want? Did you ask a shaila on where you sent your kids to school? But you made a decision where you sent the kids to school, and that impacted greatly on what the Torah is going to be. And the point is that in asking that shaila, you would have known what the rabbi would have told you to do in terms of what school you're going to go to. Fact is we do make individual decisions in our world today by determining what brand of Torah we are going to follow. So there's a certain amount of autonomy there. But just one thing. It's interesting because I was once talking about this with Rabbi Breitowitz, and he said something very interesting to me. He says people come up to him and say, "I have to ask a shaila." So they ask him. He doesn't want to paskins. He's not going to answer. Okay, fine. So he says, "Okay, but who should we ask?" So he won't tell you who to ask either, because he knows when each one of those people that you want to know, he'll know what they'll say. So if he tells you go ask that person over there, he is effectively paskening for you by telling you go ask that person. So he won't even tell you who to ask. Okay, which I thought was really right on, because the fact is we do have an aspect of our own decision making. Now, at the same point in time, it is not the decision to eat pork. You're right. That's outside the belt. It's a limited decision within a certain parameter. But there is that aspect of it. And the point is we have that aspect of it. I mean, we have that aspect. But the point is it correct or not correct? The interesting thing about that is it shows an aspect of the will of the individual in the relationship to the authority of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a lot of issues of this, and I'm not trying to take away from the fact of Avodah Hashem. We'll talk about Mesiras Nefesh and other things like that in terms of being bound to the authority figure. But the point is that what I'm trying to say is that at the mechanics of Torah, the authority figure, i.e. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, does something that usually authority figures don't do. It passes on some level of autonomy to the individual. Now, is it at the broad autonomy? No. There's parameters on that autonomy. But there is an aspect of the will that's passed on. And if the aspect of that will is passed on to the individual, then already HaKadosh Baruch Hu is creating a being that will start having questions, and we're going to see that as we go further into it, in terms of the issues and so forth. But already the being is not just supposed to be a robot; he's supposed to have his own perspectives. And we'll see how far that can go within the system, or whether it actually steps outside the system.
I still think. I still think that there's a lot, and it's passed on. Even if you make that decision, who you're asking. So, okay, I want to be more from, so I'm going to ask this person.
Right.
But it's still not on me, and I have to, if I'm going to be.
Oh, you're right. There is an aspect of the system of having knowledge in the system. It's not the autonomy of the world. What I'm saying though is that what I'm saying at this point in time, and further go into this, what I'm saying is that it starts opening up personal ethics, personal perspectives, where something comes from within you to have an impact on it. In other words, when you're thinking of it like this, again, the doer who makes the decision for the doer? Is it external? Okay, that's nice. God tells you what to do. But here, God tells you what to do, but at some point in time, there's some aspect of this telling you what to do that passes on a certain level to you to say, hey, you have to be involved. So therefore, already I'm sort of fanning the individuality of the person, fanning the autonomy of the person. Is it going to be the extreme of the world out there, relativists and morality, do everything you want? No, it's not going to be like that. There's obviously going to be the continuation, the reality of that authority figure. There's going to be parameters on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Therefore, your personal morality, your own constructs are not going to have the final voice. But already when the Kodesh Baruch Hu telling you to think and become involved in the decision of what I want you to do, I am telling you, you have to be a bar chachi. You have to start getting involved. And you should learn. There's an interesting point that I've heard from a couple of people. Like, for example, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, right, who's Rosh Yeshiva in Baltimore, was Rosh Yeshiva here, and so forth. His viewpoint was that everyone was supposed to be a posek for themselves. Because you don't have that knowledge, you can't be. But really, the ultimate perfection is that everyone has the ability to know Torah and make the decisions for himself. That's the ultimate objective.
Okay. We're supposed to get close to Hashem, which ultimately means that. But understand it, you get close to Hashem by developing your own abilities. That's a very different perspective than master-slave in a simplistic fashion. And that's what I'm really going to try to do, that we build up an understanding of the human being. It's different than a simplistic understanding that really creates a different dynamic in Torah than most people think. The fact is that here you have a remarkable statement that says what we want in terms of the master relationship is the master says, I want someone who is fanning the individual to sort of become something of his own power or whatever, which is usually not what every other master does. You know, other masters want you totally to negate yourself totally.
Yeah, I just want to say, this question of the authority figure that you seek advice from, or asking from, is you can choose a Rav by who is more lenient and who is stricter. That can be a decision. But the other factor in when you're choosing a Rav is you can choose a Rav who is very authoritarian, or one who comes to a conclusion in discussion with you about the subject. And I think in making that choice, you make a tremendous choice about your relationship with Allah.
You also, there is choosing a Rav based upon a kula or a chumrah. I mean, like the Gemara in Eruvin says, if you follow the chumras of Beis Hill and the chumras of Beis Shammai, then you're the pasuk that's happened with you is Aksil b'choshech yelech. You're an idiot. Okay? If you choose the kulas of Beis Hill and the kulas of Beis Shammai, you're a Rasha. Okay? The point is that if you follow Beis Hill or Beis Shammai until the final Nishma halacha, this was it. Whichever way you wanted to go was fine. But what made someone choose Beis Hill and Beis Shammai? It's the same way today. The fact is what makes someone choose, be a Lubavitcher, be a Dati Lumi person, be a Satmar, whatever it is. The fact is that all of a sudden, and it's so interesting hearing a person say things and says, my Rav says this and this, as if this is the Rav, is the final total authority. Good, your Rav says this. This person's Rav says not like that. The point is that so many people, they think they choose a Rav, and they think that all of a sudden they made the decision of who the Rav or the final posek for Gans Klal Yisrael should be. It doesn't work that way. The point is you've made a decision. It could be for a variety of reasons. It could be but it has a lot to do with what you think Yiddishkeit is about. When a person picks an authoritarian Rav versus a Rav who will discuss everything with him, he'll sit there and say, well, I think this is what Judaism's about. There's also interesting things in terms of how Rabbanim work also. I think I mentioned this last week, but Saul Berman, Rabbi Saul Berman, says he was talking with the Rav about adoption. And there's a big issue in adoption about whether an adopting parent what the law is to the adopting parent to the adopted child in terms of a lot of halachic issues, such as, let's say, yichud or touching. In other words, there's normative behavior of a parent to a child. Right? You can be misachid with your child. You can hug your child. This is normative behavior. If you don't do that, you will have real problems in your parent-child relationship. Okay? So the point is there's an issue that comes up with adopted parents. Okay? If you tell the adopted child, you have to apply all the standard. It's not a karov, it's a stranger, like physically a stranger. So if you apply all the laws of adoption to that person, then you can't be misyachid with them after a certain age, wherever that age is. It might even be 3 for a girl. It might be 11 for a girl. Whatever it is, there's issues in terms of touching them, of just giving a hug, or I'm talking in terms of a father, right, or a mother with a son. Questions of 9 or 12 or whatever. The point is that it's very clear that it'd be very difficult if those laws apply like that. If you held to adopt. Be very, very problematic in terms of adopting and rating a psychologically healthy family situation. So the point is, it's a big machlokes. Chazon Ish held yichud absolutely applies, all the laws applies. It's not your karov. It's Chazon Ish's position. The Lubavitcher Rebbe held the exact same way. Okay. The Rav, Rabbi Shaber, held not like that. He said that it was really dependent upon the relationship. Okay, there's certain aspects. For example, people find this hard to believe, like when I say this, but if you look in the halachas, yichud between 2 men is also a question, because homosexuality is also an arayas, and you can't do it. And the problem is a problem with arayas, with yichud with arayas. So how is it that you have 2 men being misyachid, right? So the Shulchan Aruch basically says, because we have no belief, or we assume that there's no drive between men. Okay, so therefore, it really says is that since we assume that there's not going to be any type of interest between men, we can relax the rules of yichud. Okay, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. One of the notes that came on the Shulchan Aruch says that's only dependent upon a certain society. If you find a society that's not like that, then there is a problem with yichud with men. The person also says maybe you should be machmir anyways. I mean, the fact is that it's something that people don't take for granted. People take for granted, but there's actually an issue involved. But out of that idea comes the idea that yichud is dependent upon the actual psychology of the situation. So if you actually raise a child, especially if you had a child at childbirth that you adopted, and you raise him in a parent model, then normally the normative parenting emotions will come into effect. So that's the Rav's argument, that if there is normal parenting emotions and they come into effect, there's no problem with yichud, and you can have a relationship like any other relationship between a parent and child. That's the Rav's position. So Rabbi Berman said he asked the Rav, so he was talking about the Rav, and the Rav says, and you're wondering what the Rebbe does in this situation, right? If the Rebbe knows there's a couple in Crown Heights, can't have kids, and the Rebbe thinks it'd be very, very good for this couple to adopt, and the Rebbe held like the Chazon Ish. So what do you think the Rebbe does in that situation? So the Rav asks, says, what do you think the Rebbe does in that situation? I'll tell you what he does. He tells anyone he thinks should adopt to go ask a shaila from me, because he knows my psak. So he tells one of his chasidim who he thinks should adopt, right, to go and ask a shaila from the Rav, because he knows the Rav will be materit.
Well, how can he do that?
It's a good question. How can he do that? The point is that it obviously reflects a much more complex understanding of Jewish ethical perceptions. Same thing with a guna situation. Here you have a situation of a guna, and then everyone's trying to figure out, I don't like a guna, so let's try and figure out how to get out of this, because I really am upset by this. Well, what are you upset? That's God's law. What are you upset for? Oh, all of a sudden you have your own personal perspective that there's something wrong with a guna? That's God's law. But I work, again, within the system, within the rules. If you can't work out a heter, then you're stuck. But you know how many people worked out heterim? It's just, all I'm trying to say is that, and I'm sort of jumping ahead because we have a whole system to go through here. But I'm just trying to say that right off the bat, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the authority figure, does something that empowers the ones that he has authority over. And that first step I'm saying right now of how he does that is by saying, in the system, with parameters, not telling you how to think separately. Okay, all these other cases talk about thinking separately, but in the system, I'm empowering you to make decisions within the system, which means that your underlying methodologies of analysis have to come forward. Your will has to come out a little bit. Within the rules of the game, within the parameters of the game. That is the first step that opens up a perspective that says, whoa, the ethics are not simply this ethics as God said and my choice is to do or not to do. God already off the bat by presenting Torah in this way that demands analysis and saying you have to think, you have to learn, you have to work this through. I am calling upon you to be a thinking individual. That already brings out the will. And that already brings out a different dynamic. Now, if you've seen this, you can notice that there's a lot you can argue about this that you see from different perspectives of how different drachim in Torah. There's certain people who want to recreate the simplistic will, and therefore they work with codes, and they'll say the halacha is, and they don't want to even give any perception that there's actual analysis behind it. And there's people who, I understand how to deal, but people think the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is, that's the halacha. And what do you mean some other rabbi says something differently? I never heard of such a thing. There's people who have no idea how halacha really works. They don't understand that there's decisions involved in terms of poskim. They think that this is the law, and any deviation must be from some conservative or reform perception. Because there's a perception that, especially in after the development of the reform, because of the concern, because people could misapply these ideas, such as what the reform did, and the conservatives, there's an idea to try and entrench and only present it in the authoritative perspective of one law, and this is the way it is. Presenting it that way. But in order to maintain the bottom line, the person should follow the authority. But there is that perspective.
I think, in the example that you gave of the Rebbe's suggestion.
Right.
I think that one has to understand that this was an area where the Rebbe held that I have a position, but there is a spectrum
position, yes,
of positions to take on it. So I'm not holding that mine is the only view.
See,
there might be other areas where a Rav would say, I don't believe there's a spectrum. I believe there is correct position, and another position is incorrect. In that case, he wouldn't send him just to make life easier.
I don't know if that's true. So the point is that's an interesting point. My daughter actually just brought this up with me. But when you look at Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, Elu be'elu is not similar to secular tolerance. Because on a certain level, you look at stories Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai fought. There's a famous case in the Gemara, I forget the details, where Beis Shammai worked it out that they were in charge They had the majority one day, and they tried to ram through a bunch of halachas. They felt they were right. It's an interesting tension that what I say is in the base medrash you have to think you're right and the other guy's wrong, and you have to fight. And then when you walk away, it's not the perception, well, I may be wrong, you might be right. It's a perception, I'm right? But when I leave the base medrash, I have to accept the fact that you have an opinion that you think is right, and I have to somehow respect that opinion, even though I think I'm right. It's not the way you say it. I would presume, and it's obviously questioning because.
But he obviously didn't think the Rav's opinion was wrong.
No, the fact is at some level he thought it was wrong, and some level he still loved it. The fact is that that's the tension of Elu Ve'elu versus Emes.
Right, I have trouble with that also because it's like driving to shul on Shabbos. I mean, you could say that, so that if people don't live near shul, they have to drive, and how else are they going to get there?
Right.
So it's the same thing as the example you.
Okay. You see, the thing is like this: is that argument is a problematic argument because that's not a halachic argument. The driving to shul on Shabbos, there's no posek from the Orthodox perspective who would matter it.
But
right?
Touching a stranger is also.
You're right. They're both exactly the same thing. The fact is that the differing opinion is a acceptable halachic opinion. In other words, what you're left with is a certain amount of paradox. On one hand, you have to think you're right, but you also, in this perspective, you have to believe that the other person is applying the constructs, and his conclusion he believes is right, and I have to respect that conclusion. In other words, not every. It's not that it's like you have certain constructs which are acceptable within halacha. Constructs outside of those acceptable ones are totally dismissed. Okay, in the definitions of tolerance, there's a difference between tolerance based upon tinik shenishba, which is a certain level of tolerance, and there's a tolerance based upon elu ve'elu. Tolerance based upon tinik shenishba, the person who was captured by non-Jews, basically someone brought up not from or something like that. So the tinik shenishba decision is you have tolerance towards the individual. You're not going to say that he's culpable for his behavior. But if that person, let's say a conservative rabbi, says swordfish is kosher, right? If another person came by and said to you, I hold like that rabbi, please pass me the swordfish, you would be over lifnei iver. Because that decision is not acceptable, and it doesn't have any weight in the halakhic process. But if you have two from people who are legitimate poskim, and they have a disagreement on, let's say, kashrus, and one says it's mutter and the other person held it's aser, and he goes absolutely it's aser. There's no way. He thinks you're totally wrong. You're absolutely wrong in applying your constructs. Absolutely wrong, but you're applying the right constructs. And someone comes by and says, I hold that, that's my Rav, right? Could you please pass me that food over there, which you hold is aser, but my Rav holds is mutter? There's no problem from lifnei iver of doing that, because vis-a-vis that person, he's not doing an avera because he's following the psak of the other Rav.
As long as within the Orthodox.
Right. But the fact is that within the constructs, you can still think that person is totally wrong, absolutely wrong. But since it's within the constructs, I can respect his opinion as an opinion that is acceptable within the system. So on a certain level, you're sort of saying, well, I think you're wrong about saying that God said this. So if you had a narrow perception like that, you would say, you're wrong, and the authority figure said not, but somehow the authority figure has given you this other side to it that says you have to respect individuals' thinking as well. even though you think you're totally wrong. He's totally wrong. I'm telling you to respect his opinion. Okay? And there are classic examples of that in perspectives where people they argued left and right within the system, but it wasn't. They said, well, maybe you're. It was like, I hold you 100% wrong, pursuant to the analysis of the constructs. However, it's you're applying the system, so therefore I have to respect it as a decision by the system. But what I'm just trying to say from this point in time, okay, I mean, that's a whole different discussion about tolerance, the Behaviour, stuff like that. But what I'm just trying to say that from this perspective, what I'm getting to in terms of this idea of revelational ethics, principles, going back to our topic, is that there's this development of the individual. Okay, and what we're seeing is that the individual is supposed to have some type of will, be it a moral will or whatever. And the point is that that's an interesting wording, but the starting point of the perception of revelation is, doesn't matter what I think, doesn't matter what I feel. The ultimate idea of some people in terms of revelation is, I should be a robot. God should tell me what to do and I should do it. Lift your hand, lift my hand. Right? What's going on inside me doesn't matter, and not only that, it can actually cause problems. If you thought about the Akedah, you can sit there and say, if Avram had a problem because he had feelings for Yitzchak and his perception of justice, but the point is that really maybe the ideal should be get to a point where there's no other feelings, there's no other emotions. God says, do it, I'm going to do it. Right? The point is already right off the bat, God doesn't do that. God says, and I don't want you to be a robot. And the first starting point is, you have to think. And the system that I'm going to give you demands you to make some decisions within the parameters of the system, but it demands of your will to come out.